morning, everybody, and welcome to today's CBCS seminar that's going to be hosted by Dr. Geoff Heard here. My name is Rebecca Cramp. I'm a comparative physiologist in Craig Franklin's Ecophysiology Lab, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome Geoff to UQ and to give the seminar today. So just a very brief potted history from me. Geoff's going to talk about his own academic journey. So just the highlights from me today. So Geoff is an ecologist and herpetologist with a particular interest in amphibian and reptile spatial and temporal dynamics. And so he's using that knowledge to inform conservation and planning. He's been involved in a huge range of projects, including amphibian population responses to the 2019-2020 bushfires and in response to disease and urbanisation changes. So Geoff undertook his PhD and undergrad at La Trobe University. His PhD was on growling grass frog conservation. He then continued this conservation project with a postdoc on an ARC linkage project at the University of Melbourne with Kristen Paris and Michael McCarthy. He then took off to the University of York to take up a postdoc with Professor Chris Thomas. He then came back to Australia where he took up a lectureship at Charles Sturt University, where he was teaching into the Wildlife and Ecology Management course, and then spent some time at the Arthur Riley Institute as the senior scientist in wildlife ecology. In 2020-2021, he moved back to Queensland and undertook a postdoc through the NESP Threatened Species Recovery Hub in conjunction with the Australian National University, looking at the impacts of the 2019-2022 bushfires on threatened rainforest frogs. And in November last year, Geoff joined UQ and TERN as the Threatened Species Index Project Manager, where amongst other things, he oversees TSX's collation and curation activities to ensure that TSX provides the most accurate and up-to-date information about Australia's threatened frog species. So I'd like you to join me in thanking Geoff for presenting the seminar today, and I welcome you to the stage.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. I'll just get this microphone sorted. Okay, can you hear me okay? Yep. Okay, well, seeing out on Zoom if you can't hear us. Thanks so much, Rebecca, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for the invite to come today. It's a great privilege to present to you today, and I wanted to take the opportunity to thank you as well for the opportunity to join CBCS as an affiliated researcher. UQ, of course, has been incredibly strong in ecology and conservation biology for many years now, and the work that you've done has very much influenced my own research. So it's a real thrill to join you, and I'm looking forward to collaborating with you in the years ahead. So as Rebecca mentioned, I've recently taken up the project manager position with the Threatened Species Index through TERN, based over at Long Pocket. But I'm only going to touch on that very briefly today at the end. I'll encourage you to all get involved in the TSX at the end of the presentation. I wanted to take the opportunity today to give you a bit of a background on my research and why I've spent 2 decades worrying about threatened frogs. Bit of an issue. Yep. Okay, so I thought I'd start where it all began. It wasn't meant to go this way. I was meant to be a famous snake biologist by this stage in my career. I grew up obsessed with snakes. I was going to be the next Rick Shine, publishing on myriad papers on our rare and exotic snakes from all over the country. But I got waylaid on this journey, and it happened after my honours. I did an honours degree or project on inland carpet pythons, and then I took up a role as an ecological consultant for a couple of years. And one of the major projects that we had was on this beautiful beast, the growling grass frog. And I was smitten and sidetracked, and I've been sidetracked ever since from my snake career. I think one of the reasons why I got smitten with frogs is not just that they're amazing creatures, but that they're also very much in trouble. And I found myself drawn into that cause, and I've been committed to that cause ever since. I'm 22 at that stage. Okay, so reasons to worry about amphibians, and why I realised pretty early on in the piece that we do have a lot of work to do to conserve our frogs and our amphibians globally. So in terms of global statistics, 40% of amphibians that have been assessed by the IUCN are listed as threatened or near threatened. That's a pretty staggering statistic when you think about it. And within that percentage, we've got some concerning percentages as well. So almost 10% listed as critically endangered, 15% listed as endangered. So almost a quarter of species that have been assessed are within those highest categories of threat. So real concerns there globally in terms of amphibian conservation. In Australia, I'm going to draw on a project that I was involved with a few years ago. So this was published in 2020. It was a review of the status of Australia's frogs. And the results of that review are very much in line with the global trends. So of the then 243 species of frogs in Australia, 19%, 45 were assessed. 4 species were uplisted to critically endangered, really down to just a few populations left. And 2 more species were assessed as extinct, bringing our total to 5 species. But the real total is 8 species. So we've got 3 species that the next time this is done will be listed as extinct. They haven't been seen for several decades. And just as an aside, 6 of those 8 species are endemic to Queensland. So many reasons to worry about our frogs and their conservation. What's been driving this decline, both in Australia and globally? The trends are very similar. So the key drivers have really been disease, and specifically the amphibian chytrid fungus, which I'll talk a bit about today. Climate change, of course, is a burgeoning issue for amphibian conservation. And then habitat loss, degradation, and fragmentation. So these really have been the key drivers in Australia. But we're now seeing also contributions from changes in fire regimes and also invasive species and invasive fish in particular for many of our amphibians. So, to today's seminar. So my objectives for today, the 2 objectives. First, to provide an insight into these 3 key threatening processes for our frogs, and specifically using my own research, how they manifest, the impacts they have. And this is the depressing bit, unfortunately. But I'm going to try and then pick you up again in the second half of the talk and talk about actions that we can take to mitigate these threats. And one of the encouraging things that I've found in my 2 decades working on these frogs is that solutions do emerge once we start looking for them and thinking about them in detail. And they're really tangible actions that we can take. So as I say, this is the hopeful bit, and hopefully I'll pick you all up. But first, we've got to get through the depressing bit. Okay, so I'm going to start with habitat loss, and under that banner, degradation and fragmentation of habitat. And I'm going to use the work we've been doing on growling grass frogs north of Melbourne as the example here. It's a really good case study in the process of habitat loss, degradation and fragmentation for many Australian frogs. This particular case study is about urbanisation, but the trends are relevant to other ways of habitat loss and fragmentation, particularly through agriculture. But also it's a case study in the failure of our environmental law to protect threatened species habitat in Australia. And that's both for frogs and more generally. My first task is to make you fall in love with this frog, as I did 20 years ago. So this is a little metamorph from the Merri Creek, about 20 kilometres north of the Melbourne CBD. Stunning little frog. They are a largely aquatic tree frog, so they do have toe pads, which you can see on this image, but you can see they're also very reduced. They spend most of their time in water and in aquatic vegetation around the edge of our wetlands. They metamorphose at about 3 centimetres in length, and then they can grow to these behemoths. So this is a female that they can grow up to 10 centimetres in length, and the heaviest I've weighed was 80 grams. So a really sizable frog, one of the biggest frogs in Australia. And as you can see, just a spectacular beast. And I never get tired of seeing them. Okay, so growling grass frogs are one of many species that declined sharply in Australia in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And that was due to chytrid fungus and its sweep across the eastern seaboard of the continent. And they shrunk back, growling grass frogs that is, shrunk back to lowland areas. As I'll show you later, they dropped out of higher altitude areas. And one of the areas that they persisted in quite well after that initial decline was around Melbourne. So this is in pink here, the Melbourne metropolitan area as it stood about a decade ago. And all of those black dots are records of growling grass frogs post 2. So you can see lots of populations on the outskirts of Melbourne. But sadly, those locations are almost perfectly aligned with urban growth. So that light shading there is urban growth zones around Melbourne. And they're in fact much bigger than that today. This map is a little bit old, but it's useful in showing the alignment between where remnant populations of this frog occur and our urban growth zones. So real concern about the impact of that on this species, particularly given that this is an area that hosts significant remnant populations. So in 2001 and 2002, we embarked on this project to monitor growling grass frogs across one of these urban growth zones. So north of Melbourne, you might be familiar with the Merri Creek, which runs into the north of Melbourne. That's one of the main catchments that we work in. And we've been monitoring the frog in this study area ever since. So we just completed our last field survey in last month. And we've had over 200 sites. We've now done over 3,000 surveys in that area. And we've been specifically tracking the occupancy dynamics of the species, tracking habitat change and the march of urbanisation. And I'll just skip back. These are some of the sites that we work on. So pools along the streams themselves, farm dams, the middle one there, and then also flooded quarries. So this frog does really, really well in flooded quarries. There was a lot of bluestone extraction and still some going on in this area, and also quarrying for brick making. And the frogs move into the flooded quarries and do really well in those environments. So I'm going to jump straight into the results of this work and what they tell us about the impact of urbanisation on this species. So in that first season, 01-02, we had almost 90 sites occupied, an occupancy rate of around about 40%, which surprised me. And we also found some really great populations, some really abundant, lots of reproduction going on, really strong populations. So that was an exciting result. But the subsequent 16 years have seen quite a steady decline. So almost a 30% decline in occupancy in the subsequent years. The black dots there are years when we've tried to do a full resurvey of all of our sites across the study area. And the open dots are imputed in part by our occupancy model that we fit to these data, but there's various scattered surveys in those intervening years as well. So yeah, as I say, every fifth year we're trying to do these surveys. So up until this last season, 16-17 was our previous year of full surveys. And what does it look like after our season just gone? It looks fairly terrible. So they've declined by over 50%. Sorry, not quite. Yeah, over 50% in that time period. This figure will change a little bit once we actually come to analyse the data. But we can be fairly confident based upon our detection probabilities that this number will hold. So we've seen a huge decline in occupancy over that 2-decade time span. And I wanted to give you an insight into why this is happening using a particular case study. This is a landscape that I first encountered in December 2001. It's on the edge of Epping and Laylaw, north of Melbourne. And what you can see there, is there a pointer? There is a pointer. So what you can see there is a landscape that has former quarries in it. So those larger water bodies are former bluestone pits that are filled with water. There is a golf course down on the southwest there. It's the old Laylaw golf course. And then what's not so obvious is a few scattered other water bodies in that landscape. And you can already see urbanisation creeping up on this landscape from the southeast. So December 2001, we found the frogs in these locations, a really strong metapopulation and lots of frogs in these quarry pits and spilling out into the surrounding golf course and some of those surrounding wetlands as well. So a fully functioning metapopulation. Fast forward 10 years and we've seen very significant change in that landscape. So we've got the Burn bypass, the Hume Highway going through the middle. So that was put in about 2003. We've got another road extension that's cut off the eastern section of the metapopulation, and urbanisation is marching north and west. And we saw a significant decline at that resurvey, and primarily in the west. So those quarry sites have been started to be filled in. So they were landfilled, and we lost habitat through that process and also lost the connection to the old golf course. Skip forward another 10 years and the landscape looks like this today. It's almost completely urbanised. The Melbourne wholesale markets, which is that really big one right in the middle, went in. And this is where the frogs are today. They're completely hemmed into one remaining quarry network. And that network has a development plan in place for it, and it will be gone when we do this again in 10 years. So when we do this surveys again in 10 years, the frogs will be almost certainly gone. So this is the process. And as I say, it's not just an insight into the process of habitat loss and degradation and fragmentation, but also the fact that we haven't been able to preserve any of this habitat, essentially. There's been myriad schemes, offsetting schemes, for example, in this landscape to try and keep the frogs, culverts under roads, small artificial wetlands put in, etc. But they've all been ineffective, and it's almost certain that we will lose the frogs in that landscape. I did say this was the depressing bit. Okay, so on to the next major threat and climate change. We've, of course, been very cognizant of the impact that climate change is going to have on our biodiversity for many decades, and we've done lots of work on this threat. For us specifically, what we've done as ecologists has been to build species distribution models and project the changes in occupancy or occurrence of our species with increasing CO2 and increasing temperatures from those models. And for me personally, they gave me something of an optimistic view of climate change and the pace of its impacts. Started to think of this as a gradual process, something that will play out over decades and gradually reduce the range size of our amphibians. And but that all changed, of course, with the Black Summer fires. So these were a real wake-up call for me personally about the mechanisms of change under global warming, and effectively what these fires and the preceding incredibly intense drought told me was that species won't be gradually pushed off the top of mountains or out of flammable heathland. They'll be just burnt off in a mega fire, as terrible as that is. So I was able to get a bit more of an insight into this process through the NEST project that Rebecca mentioned I was involved in. So these are 3 species of mountain frogs that occur in southeastern Queensland and northern New South Wales. They're all members of the genus Floria, these great little burrowing frogs, and they occur in the wettest parts of the rainforests of essentially the Gondwana World Heritage Area. And these frogs, despite living in the wettest part of one of the wettest places in Australia, were impacted by these mega fires. And so I was involved in a project, so this was led by Ben Shield, and in collaboration with Newell and Liam Bolitho from Southern Cross Uni, and also Harry Hines from the Department of Environment and Science, to go and try and assess the impacts of these of the fires on these rainforest frogs. So this is what they normally look. This is what their habitat normally looks like. So right at the tops of the mountain ranges in the first spring seeps, essentially in the gullies, really wet rainforest. But of course, a lot of that dried out to an unprecedented level during the drought that preceded the Black Summer fires. And we had significant fire penetration into those rainforests. And in fact, unprecedented penetration of fire into those rainforests and also into the ecotonal wet sclerophyll forest. So on the right there is a site in the main range. In fact, it's the site where one of these frogs was first collected from at Cunningham's Gap. And it burnt pretty hot right up and into the rainforest. In fact, both of these sites are from the main range. So in collaboration with Harry and Liam and Dave Newell, we set out to survey some of their monitoring sites across the range post-fire to gauge these impacts. We surveyed 5 sites for Filoria knowlesi. It's a very freshly described species. So that was in the Mount Barney area. Most of the work was concentrated on Filoria kundagungan and Filoria richmondensis. And we increased our sample size to take in some of the burnt sites as well. We assessed habitat condition and burn severity at each site and obtained remote sense measures of fire and drought severity right across the landscape. So what did we find? The map on the right there shows you the distribution of fire relative to the range of these frogs. In the middle is the Mount Barney complex, and you can see really heavily affected. The main range going up to the northwest, which is primarily Filoria kundagungan habitat, and then Filoria richmondensis is down in the south of that study area. So some really significant percentages of suitable habitat burnt. And remember that these are the wettest parts of the landscape, really upland, saturated, usually saturated rainforest environment. So 54% of suitable habitat for Filoria knowlesi had some level of impact, 30% for Filoria kundagungan, and you can see most of that through the main range, and 12%, a much lower percentage for Filoria richmondensis, and most of that was concentrated in the bottom of the Richmond Range, where the fires swept in from the southwest. In terms of occupancy impacts, we found for both Filoria kundagungan and Filoria richmondensis a significantly lower occupancy rate amongst the burnt sites and the unburnt sites. And this relationship held for abundance as well. So clear impacts, but I should say here that there's a conflation between whether a site burnt or not and its previous habitat quality, because the wettest sites where these frogs at the higher elevations were less likely to burn. So these figures are not quite accurate. They're a bit more dire than they suggest in raw terms, but still evidence of impacts on these species, which normally never see fire. Onto disease. Okay, so I'm specifically talking here about chytrid fungus. You're probably all very aware of this pathogen and its impacts on our frogs. So this is an example. This is Latoria rheacola from the wet tropics, and it crashed at mid and higher elevation sites when chytrid swept through in the early 1990s. This is some great monitoring that was done by Keith McDonald and colleagues. And the same was true for several other frogs, Latoria nonotis at the top there, Tordactylus acutirostris, which is now one of the species that's extinct, and also what was then known as Latoria genimaculata, which is now Latoria serrata. It declined, but not completely crashed out of some of these sites. So this is the story that you hear about chytrid, is this initial arrival and the cause of a significant epizootic and crashes, many of which they never recover from. But there's an ongoing process with our frogs in Australia as well, and that is now that chytrid is endemic, it's causing ongoing decline. So for some species like the growling grass frog, we had that initial decline, initial crash, and you can see here that the species in terms of its range, crashed out of many areas and generally the colder parts of the landscape. And we have had a stabilisation, but the process of decline continues. So there's a couple of populations in this graph, which, or this map, I should say, which dropped out in the last La Nina. So 11, 12. So this was up in the Middo Valley, one of the, well, it was the last remnant population in northeastern Victoria. And during that last La Nina, it crashed out. So we've got these ongoing declines occurring, and this is true for several of our species. Some of my own work on this. So during my PhD on growling grass frogs, I did a marker capture study. I swabbed every frog that I caught for chytrid fungus. And I subsequently looked at the relationship between survival probability and infection intensity. So zoospore load there is just a measure of infection intensity. And to my surprise, actually, we found a reasonably strong relationship between infection intensity and survival rate. And so the fungus continues to be a threat. It continues to cause mortality and drive declines. And when we look at the occupancy data, we can see a strong relationship between the seasonal prevalence of chytrid infections and the probability of local extinction. So that decline I showed you earlier is not just due to urbanisation. There are some populations that have not been affected by urbanisation at all that have been impacted by chytrid, and we've lost them as a result. So ongoing pressure in where chytrid is endemic. Okay, so that's the depressing bit over. Hopefully I can pick you back up again now and run through for each of those threats some of the things we can do to tackle these declines. And I'm going to start back with habitat loss. So reasons for hope in this area. The one I want to talk about, there's various reasons here, of course, but the one I want to talk about is that many of our frogs are incredibly responsive to habitat protection, but also restoration and habitat creation. Many of our wetland breeding frogs can be really incredibly responsive to this. And so I'm hopeful that despite this long-term trajectory, that we can start to turn this around as we tackle the threat north of Melbourne and indeed generally. And just to give you an example for growling grass frogs, this is a wetland that was created in Bundoora specifically for the frog in 2003, and it was adjacent to some existing populations, and they responded within weeks to the filling of this site and were breeding in it within weeks. And in fact, that frog pictured there is one of the individuals, the early colonists of this site from the adjoining Darebin Creek. And that habitat supported the frogs for almost up, it was probably 17 years in total. So we found that they've just blipped out from this site. And the reason for that is that it wasn't maintained. So if this site was maintained, it would have carried the population on. And so there is the potential for success, and with a fairly small investment in these urbanising landscapes. The other reason I've got a bit of hope there around this is that the Victorian government for growling grass frogs is really getting on board with habitat creation. So we've protected now 7 conservation corridors around urban Melbourne. And within that, there is a plan to build dedicated wetlands for the species. So 90 wetlands are planned to be built across peri-urban Melbourne in the next few decades. The design of that work has been very much guided by our work on habitat requirements for the frog. So 20 years of work has fed really directly into these policies that have been developed. And the locations of these new wetlands as well have been optimised based on our work. So one of the key things that I've done for this species and with many colleagues is to try and build meta-population models. So models that can predict the occupancy dynamics of these frogs under different habitat management scenarios. And we published a paper on this a couple of years back. So Mike Scroggy from the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning led this work. And what we did was couple our existing metapopulation models with a simulated annealing algorithm to try and sort through, we mapped out all these locations for every one of our conservation corridors. We mapped out all these potential locations where wetlands could go, and that's those little grey polygons you can see in this corridor. And then we ran the metapopulation model with our simulated annealing algorithm to identify which would be the best combination for a set budget to maximise metapopulation viability. And that's one of the examples for it's Cororote Creek in the northwest. And so I'm quite confident that the amount of work we've put in and the understanding that we have about this species, that this plan can work, and that we've covered off on the requirements of the frog. What is uncertain is how those sites will be managed long term and the funding cycle around that. But certainly the plans are in place to create these sites and then manage them long term for the frog. So I've got some hope there. What about climate change? There's a few reasons I see for hope around climate change, despite those devastating impacts of things like megafires. The first is evidence of inherent resilience. And I must admit, when these fires first kicked off, I didn't really think there would be the resilience that we have subsequently seen. So for the two species of Phaloria that we worked on up in the scenic rim and the rainforest to the south, whilst we did see a lower occupancy rate amongst bird sites, we did get them in bird sites. And we got them in reasonably good numbers in some bird sites, even some sites that were burnt quite severely. And so that was quite encouraging. Once the rains returned, these frogs would have been buried down in quite deep into the saturated soil. They returned to the surface and started breeding, and we did see successful breeding in many of these sites. So that was encouraging. The other thing that encouraged me, despite the depth of that incredible drought that preceded the Black Summer fires. So this is on the left there is, so this is some monitoring that was done by Dave Newell's group prior to these fires. And you can see the change in occupancy rate from 2012-13 through to just before the fires happened in 2019-20 and subsequently. And this is for Phaloria richmondensis, I should say. So we saw a bounce back in occupancy rate, and we also saw a bounce back in the abundance of calling males. And that, I must admit, did surprise me. We've also seen through this project evidence of landscape resilience and refuges. So there's been a lot of work, of course, on climate refugia through over the millennia, of course, but we also saw evidence of these short-term refuges as well. So here is parts of the study area showing mapping of fire severity and also drought severity. So this is one of these remote sensed measures of drought severity across that landscape. And whilst there's a lot of red in those two images, so blue in both is less or lower severity, we can see refuges, and there's refuges that are topographically predictable. So there's for me anyway, some hope that the work that we've been doing, trying to map out and predict climate refugia over longer timescales can be applied also to these perturbations that are climate driven. And if we can map these things, predict where they are, then we can feed them into the sorts of conservation planning and prioritisation programs that we've been looking at now for several decades. And of course, people here at UQ have been doing some terrific work around this. So I've got some confidence there. And of course, we can also support resilience for these frogs. So once we identify where these refuges are, there's very tangible things we can do to support them within these refuges. So for Phaloria, this is damage from feral pigs. They're an increasing threat for this species, and their wallowing and feeding behaviour really destroys the sort of micro hydrology and topography that they need. That's where they build their nests, and so we can support these frogs. It's fairly mundane, but we can support these frogs and many others by tackling some of these immediate threats and building their resilience. Okay, onto disease in the time I have remaining. Reasons for hope around chytrid fungus in particular. Well, there's been the encouraging natural recovery taking place for some species. So I mentioned this work, I mentioned these declines that were occurring in the 90s for many of our wet tropics frogs. Those 3 species there have all rebounded very well. So I was involved in some work with Sarah Bell and Berger and Lee Skerritt looking at this. So Sarah did these elevational transects. She climbed the mountains to find out whether the frogs had been able to recolonize higher elevations from where they crashed out of. And these 3 species had. It was really encouraging just how far these species had come at regaining their ground elevation. So there is natural recovery underway. Those species and others have been saved by environmental refuges. And what's encouraging about that is that we now understand why that's the case. We can use that understanding to guide management, and it's already happening for several species. So I'm just going to run through some examples. This isn't from my own research, but from some colleagues. So this is Latoria spenceri, the spotted tree frog, and it has been put into environmental refuges in Kosciuszko National Park. So these are areas that were predicted to be suitable for the frog, but just a bit warmer than the average. So they've got an upper hand against chytrid fungus. They were fish-free, and they also didn't have some reservoir hosts. So one of the key things with chytrid fungus is that some frogs do really well with chytrid, but carry it all around the place and infect the more susceptible species. So they've been spotted tree frogs have been introduced to locations with these characteristics and are doing fairly well. The same is true of Latoria lorica up in the wet tropics. So this is a species that was thought to be extinct for quite a few years until it was rediscovered on the western side of the wet tropics in a much drier and warmer environment. And it was the last place where this species hung on. And the reason it hung on was because it was much warmer, lots more insulation, not a high or dense canopy. And so whilst the frogs were constantly getting infected with chytrid, they can bask, shake the fungus, and carry on. And that frog has now been also translocated to another similar site with those characteristics and is doing well. Northern corroboree frogs, so Ben Shiel at ANU is involved in a project to put these frogs also into environmental refuges. And the refuge here is a location with very few or no reservoir species. So that there's a frog, a little common froglet, which occurs up here as well. And it has a really high prevalence of infections and causes spillover to this species. But we can find places that have the right characteristics for this frog, but not the right characteristics for common froglets. And so Ben's trialing putting these frogs in there and seeing whether we can establish them in these environmental refuges. From my own work, I showed you this plot earlier to demonstrate the impact of chytrid fungus on growling grass frogs. And it is quite clear, but what I didn't talk about was that at the left-hand end of that plot are environmental refuges. So there are places in this landscape that have characteristics that render them environmental refuges from disease for this species. And the characteristics are that they are warmer, so chytrid infection rates decline with water temperature. And they're also a bit saltier. So there's a lot of groundwater influx in these places. And whilst the salinity gradient is fairly small, it's enough to drive a relationship between chytrid prevalence and infection rate. So, and that's one of the reasons why those quarries that I mentioned are much better for the frog, because the salinity is not so great that it affects the frogs, but enough to lower the prevalence of chytrid fungus. So we know these relationships. We've done work, simulation studies with our metapopulation models to show that if we build wetlands with these refugial properties, that we can really shore up metapopulations of the frog. And that work has been fed into the policy that I mentioned previously. So those habitat design standards that I mentioned incorporate this. They're seeking to build wetlands that are open, get lots of sun. They're a little bit saline, so they're feeding them with a bit of bore water, and hopefully that will be enough to mitigate chytrid and keep the frogs going in those new sites. Okay, so I promised that I would mention the TSX before closing. So yeah, this is a really exciting project, one that has come out of CBCS and is now being run through TERN over at Long Pocket. If you aren't familiar with the TSX, please jump on our website and have a look. We're collating data now on threatened species trends from right across the country. And so yeah, please do get involved. We'd love to work with you on not just updating the index, but also research using the really extensive database that we've put together for threatened species trends from right across the country. I'll close there and say thank you very much.